And Dr. Dianne Hall is an ecologist with the St. John's Water Management District. She has lived most of her life in Florida, arriving before Walt Disney, and grew up on a lake in Polk County surrounded by citrus and cattle. Her main focus at the district is the restoration and adaptive management of marshes and forested wetlands, mainly focused in the upper basin of the St. Johns River. Her objective is to maximize wetland habitat quantity and quality within areas that are mainly engaged for flood protection and water supply. She's been working on the ecology and management of willows for over 12 years and would like to share with you some of the district's findings on the germination and survival of young willows in the upper basin marshes.
To talk about today is from work that was done by Doctors John Fouth and Pedro Quintana Asensio out of the University of Central Florida and their students. So, John, I hope I do you guys justice. Carolina willow, it's a native species, and it's a common and important component of freshwater marshes throughout most of Central Florida. It normally co-occurs with species like sawgrass and cattail and bulltongue that you can see here. And research that we've done into all the marsh communities in the upper basin have shown that willow communities harbor more species of other plants and insects than communities that are dominated by cattails or sawgrass or maiden cane. So you can see that willow communities are important for the overall diversity of the upper basin. Willows are also excellent canaries in the coal mine. When they expand into areas that used to support herbaceous marsh, they're alerting us to the fact that environmental conditions have changed in their favor. And that's what we see happening in a lot of the St. John's marshes. This is probably the most startling example that I have. This is the St. John's Marsh Conservation Area. It's part of the Three Forks Conservation Area in Brevard County. And we've been following the spread of the shrub swamp, which is mostly dominated by willow, in this area for about 15 years. I have 10 years up here. You can see that starting in 1989, there was about 4,500 acres. By 1997, that had almost doubled to 8,000 acres. And by 2009, which is the last date that I have, it's up to 10,500 acres. So, what happened? What changed? What is the willow trying to tell us? These are 5 factors that we thought might be important in explaining the spread. Hydrology, soils which can be tied to the nutrients, because we know that peaty organic soils have more nutrients than sandy soils. Differences in fire, differences in grazing or browsing, and also the plants that are out there competing with the willow. So if we look again at the St. John's Marsh Conservation Area, you'll notice that the boundaries are all straight lines. That's because they're all canals. And what do canals do? Canals drain water. So we know in this area there's definitely been a change in hydrology. Also, if you look up at the top, we can see one area right here that seems to have resisted the encroachment of willow. And we thought, well, why should that be? Well, come to find out, that's a sandy soil rather than being a peaty soil. And so we thought soil differences or differences in nutrients that are associated with soils might be a difference. So those are the 2 main changes that hopped out at us right away. And so we went looking in the literature, looking for research on those factors and fire and grazing, anything that we could find on Carolina willow. And we found pretty much nothing had been done on it. And so that's when UCF came to our rescue, and we collaborated with them to do some experiments in the greenhouse, in the field, in artificial environments to look at what are the conditions that are favorable for the germination and the survival of young willow. And so I'm going to talk about what they found. Willow seeds in the upper basin usually disperse during February and March. Based on work that they've found, a single mature willow tree can produce about 165,000 seeds a year, 39% of which will be viable green seeds. And so that leads to 64,000 seeds that are viable being produced per tree per year. That's a lot of seeds. The good thing is that the seeds are only viable for about 10 days. So if the seeds don't find the correct conditions within those 10 days, they die. There's no seed bank that you have to worry about with willow. The seeds, though, can germinate while they're floating on water. They can also germinate when they're completely submerged. 90% of viable seeds, if they find the correct habitat, will germinate within the first day. And over 50% will germinate even if they don't get the right conditions until day 6. So they're very adaptable, and they will germinate when they find the right habitat. So we thought about the soils and the hydrology, and one of the first experiments that they did had to do with looking at the effects of both of those factors. The experiments, most of the greenhouse experiments that were set up have cups within cups. So in the inner cup you have the soil and you have the seeds, and the outer cup catches the water that flows through the first cup and acts as like the holding capacity of a soil that you would think about in the field. So what they did, we had, oops, sorry, let me go back. Next one. Okay. We had one that was done on sand, everything else was done on peat, and there were different types of additions of water. The sandy ones were watered once every 8 days. There were some that were kept on the peat that were kept completely flooded. That means they always had 2 inches of water underneath, up above the top of the soil. Some were watered every 5 days. Some were watered every 3 days, daily. And then the last one is capillarity. And what happened is the soil itself was never watered, but we kept 3 inches of water inside that second cup so that the water from the second cup was drawn up into the soil of the first cup. And that's how the seeds got their water. So as you can see, it doesn't matter if you had sand or peat, the seeds were going to germinate. There it is. Everything germinated. The only time we didn't get germination was if it was on a completely dry soil, and it didn't matter if the soil was peat or sand. If it was dry, they didn't germinate. You did get better germination on the peaty soils, and what was interesting is the best germination happened when the seeds were wet through capillarity, so pulling that water up through the soil to get to the seed. Okay, so just because they'll germinate anywhere on any type of soil, did they need a specific type of soil in order to survive? And this I have, the graphs are of mortality, but if you switch it around, it'll be to survivorship. So I'll talk about that as well. You can see what we did the same cup and cup experiment, except for everything was watered through capillarity because we knew that's where we would get the best germination. So then we took soils that had different organic matter, so different levels of nutrient. So we had peats that were high in organics. This is like 90% organics. We had peats that were low in organics, which was about 70%. And then you had sand, which is about 2% organics. And then we did 50-50 combinations of all of those. So you can see, based on this graph, the actual survivorship ranged from just over 70% to just over 90%, okay? Almost everything would come out. And it didn't matter if you had high nutrients or you had low nutrients. Everything would germinate and survive. So again, this was showing us that it was the hydrology that was driving it, because everything was the same with the capillarity, and it wasn't the soils. So what about if we move to even older seedlings and cuttings? We took pieces of the willow and cut it and had it root, and then we were trying to mimic what a sapling would be like, something that was smaller, still young, but of still small stature. And the experiments were done in the greenhouse and in the field. We ran the experiment that we did the first time that I talked about, with having sands or having peats and in these cups in cups, but we did it on these larger. And then we also added nutrients. So even the sandy soils had a nutrient. And what we found is nutrients didn't matter at all. Everything grew as long as it got water. So we started turning our focus more to hydrology, and we created these artificial islands out in the marsh. This is organic matter that we just dug up out of the marsh, made into an island, and then we planted seedlings or the little cuttings on the island and watched their survivorship and growth for 10 months. And we put little flags so we would be able to find where they were. So we monitored this as the water went up and finally back down. And you can see that there was a lot of other vegetation that colonized these islands. At the end of the experiment, most of the seedlings had died because of the prolonged high water conditions. The seedlings could not take being completely inundated by water for that long. However, 77% of the cuttings survived. And those that did were at the top two elevations on it, which was about 15 and 20 inches above the original water line. That seems to have been the sweet spot. It was high enough that it didn't get too wet when the water came up, but it wasn't too high that when everything dried out, those, dried and the willow had nothing, couldn't survive during a drought. So this tells us that the seedlings are going to be more susceptible to changes in hydrology, particularly flooding, than the cuttings are. But even the small willows, you can see some of them, oops, gosh, sorry. Come on. Okay, even at this lower elevation, you had them die because they were completely inundated by the water. So as long as they're covered for a certain amount of time, even small willows will die. So then we turned our focus to fires, and it was one of our concerns that fires that happened in February or March, they open up a lot of habitat. That's the same time that the willows are putting out all their seeds. So if we're burning in February or March, or we have a burn, an arson fire, anything like that, is that helping the willows to come in? And so the UCF students actually went out after a burn that happened in mid-February, and they sowed 1,800 seeds into patches of various size. And we went out and looked at the growth, the germination, the survivorship through the end of May, which is the end of the dry period. What was interesting is less than 7% of the seeds that were sown actually germinated, and no seedlings survived until the end of the dry season. The confounding factor that we have here, and the reason we need to do more research on this, is this happened under drought conditions. So we're not sure if the lack of germination and survival was due to the drought. So we'll want to redo that study. Next, we thought about, well, what about grazing and browsing? Is there a change? Can cows or deer, can they keep willows from coming out? Well, there's never been any grazing as far as cows go that I know of in the St. John's Marsh, so that's not a reason that we had willow expand in the St. John's Marsh. But we did want to look at this because we have other areas where we do have cattle grazing. And in fact, UCF put these exclosures out in some isolated wetlands up on district-owned lands that are north of Highway 50 on an area that we lease for cattle. And they planted the seedlings and the cuttings both inside and outside of these exclosures, and then we followed them over, I think, about 6 months is how long it lasts. And so what we found, you can see the deer have been nibbling on this one. We found that both the cattle or deer, because we had both of them, can kill the small seedlings and the small cuttings that were outside of these enclosures. The small seedlings are usually killed either through direct eating or through trampling. Trampling was a big problem. The cuttings were usually killed by being pulled up or being eaten. There were cuttings that did survive, but when they survived, their growth was really stunted. Now remember, this is young willow. This isn't a mature willow, and it's different with mature willows. So finally, we looked at competition, and we wanted to know whether competition with other plants could be a factor keeping willows out or helping willows come in. So we did 2 different experiments. One was within the floodplain of the river, where we went out and we planted seedlings or cuttings along an elevational gradient within the floodplain, and then they were either surrounded by totally herbaceous marsh or herbaceous and woody marsh, and we followed their growth. And what we found was hydrology was a problem once again, because the river came up, most of these areas were flooded. The areas where they weren't flooded, in some of the headwater marshes in Blue Cypress Marsh, the seedlings and cuttings got shaded out by the surrounding vegetation, but we need to do a little bit more work on that. We also did some experiments in some experimental ponds at UCF. We did the same thing. We planted the little seedlings and cuttings along this elevational gradient, and we planted small sawgrass to see what is the effect of smaller plants in competition with willow. And these were hand watered for a month to try and get them acclimatized, and during that same time we had the drought. So a lot of the seedlings that were at the top end and some of the cuttings, they died because we just couldn't keep them wet enough, especially in the areas where we had sandy soils that didn't hold the water like the peaty soils do. Then when we started bringing the water up, the seedlings that were at the lower elevations, they got overtopped and they died. None of the cuttings died from inundation though, because the water never got high enough to completely cover the willows. So as long as the willows were not completely covered, they survived. So there's this sweet spot, not being too wet, not being too dry. So, just to recap, hydrology is the major factor determining the germination and the survival of willow seedlings and cuttings. Mortality can occur through either drought or complete inundation. Soils seem to be important, especially peat soils, because of their ability to hold water, not because of the amount of nutrients or differences in nutrients. Fire doesn't appear to open up patches for willow colonization, but we need to do some further study on that. Grazing and browsing can limit the survival of seedlings, but usually the animals that are doing the grazing and the browsing are not going to be selective on willow, so it's not something that you could count on to control willow. Finally, competition does seem to limit the expansion of willow through shading, but most of the mortality we saw was due to the flooding. I know it's been a lot of information. I'd be happy to answer questions.
What role, if any, does the seeds from the willow provide opportunity for the duck feed? Are they a significant part of the food chain for the ducks?
I'm going to have to defer to somebody like Steve. I wouldn't think so because they don't occur in the seed bank, and they're not a very big seed at all. It doesn't seem like, but Steve?
Yeah, I would agree. It's not a
I'm just curious, in the experiment that you did with the small mounds of organic sediment, how long was that highest water level sustained for before they started coming back down?
Okay, I'm going to defer to John.
Which experiment?
The island experiment, how long was the water up that high?
It was up that high for about three. It was up that high for about 3 months, and what happened is that the willow, as it gets flooded, just grows as fast as it can and tries to keep leaves up above the surface. And usually, what would kill a cutting is if enough algae and floating aquatic plants got on top of it and put it underneath and submerged it. That could kill it. But the rest of the time, the willow just keeps growing, and stays just at or above the surface. And then when the water drops, up it goes. It's a really tough plant.
And the seedlings just couldn't grow that fast. They couldn't grow.
I'm going to take it from a different point. As a aquatic wetland manager, I'm more interested in probably what Steve Miller is going to talk about in a few minutes. Because you've had these expansions of willows, we're looking at ways to control willow, bringing the water up. I mean, how fast do you need to bring it up to be able to control the seedlings once you've reduced the biomass of adult plants? And you know, you said fire doesn't allow, or doesn't allow, I guess, for willow to grow, but will fire, once you take it through these areas, will it control the willow?
Well, I know Brian Emanuel, I think, did Brian show up? Yoo-hoo, he's back there. He's going to be talking about that. As far as how fast to bring the water up, we're talking about young seedlings. So I don't think it matters how quickly you bring it up. What matters is that you bring it up over the tops of the seedlings and you keep it there for at least 30 days. Now, we know from experience, once they get to be adults, you're never going to cover them. I mean, and they put out adventitious roots and stuff like that. They're really gnarly to get rid of once they're adults. And that's why we're focusing on what can we do once we get rid of the adults? How do we keep them from coming back in?
The area where they've expanded, what prompted this study, is that area under some sort of, or has the hydrology been changed or managed to where the drawdown or drought has been taken out of it?
We're in the beginning points of it. This past year, on the east side, that long canal that's on the east side, we've gotten 5 plugs into that canal. And it's changing the hydrology in that it's holding more water on it. I mean, on the upstream side, which is where we seem, I should say, the upstream side, which is the south, I'm sorry. The river flows north, so it's kind of crazy that way. The southern end of it is the area where we really had, right against the Fellsmere grade, that's where we really had a lot of takeoff, and that's where we had a lot of the drought and the drying and the over-drying of soils. And it's been a concern to us, not just because of the willow coming in, but the fact that once these peat soils dry out and then they get reflooded, you get loss of nutrients. You get these huge pulses of nutrients coming off. And so our whole idea is to try and back water up as much as we can onto those areas. So just this past year, we put in 5 separate plugs in the C40 canal in order to back water up on that area. And we're developing a model to show us what we have to do in order to complete the hydrologic fix in that area. And it might have something to do with putting plugs on the other side, on the western side, or putting something all the way across the marsh. So we are looking at that, because otherwise we're just gonna, be beating our head against the wall. If you take out the willow and you don't change the environment to keep it from coming back in, you're just wasting money.